Alright, try another camera angle. Yeah, see if that's quieter. I have to remember to look over this way though. That's no problem. So, another response video, Modern Mystic. Gary questions one again. Yeah, there was a problem with my videos in the order they end up showing up. So a little bit of a hostile video I did, number 12, is posted late because it got stuck in processing. And it does cover a lot of this stuff. It was titled Checks versus Cash, and you know, this is an important distinction. And this, you know, I mean, I might as well deal with an idiotic comment. These are just so irritating, you know. And so the poker face Todd guy doesn't understand anything about this conversation. He just chimes in. For a bank check to exist, Federal Reserve notes must be in an account in that amount to pay the bearer of the check whose Federal Reserve notes. The bearer of the check, those Federal Reserve notes. Banks do not write checks on their stationery based on their good credit. Well, of course they do. This isn't even a disputable fact. That's fractional reserve banking, retard. I mean, you can't say something this stupid. Banks write bad checks all the time, and they become good checks because there's no one else for the deposits to go. The deposits don't go to Mars or Uranus or some faraway place. The money, the check, gets cashed and it gets deposited in a bank. And the odds are that your bank's going to get deposits from other banks that were loans from other banks, and vice versa. And so it all works out in the end. The reserves show up after. The deposit shows up after the loan. Banks do not write checks on their own stationery, and people will go to jail for writing bad checks. Well, they don't usually go to jail for the first offense, but whatever. And certainly banks don't have to worry about going to jail for bad checks. They just go bankrupt, or they're too big to fail. Try writing a bank check on your account without federal notes to back it up. Without federal notes. Again, obviously I have to put into the bank something, but I can take to the bank a bank check, which isn't federal notes. So again, you're just wrong. Yeah, you're just wrong. So you're silly. You're stupid, and you're irritating. And you know, just you're not helping the conversation any when you can't get the premises right. And an unacceptable premise is that we have full reserve banking. We have fractional reserve banking, which means there aren't reserves covering the loans. The loans aren't backed up by gold or cash. The loans are backed up by, it's probably going to work out okay. And collateral, of course, which is always a good idea. Anyway, okay, so let's move forward from that piece of shit. So, you know, Nick has again said he doesn't like the thin boat metaphor, which I think is perfectly. I mean, he says he gets it in some kind of. Well, it feels like that makes sense, but it doesn't think like it makes sense. I'm just saying, how does it not think like it makes sense? If you're compromising something's, if you're putting something at jeopardy, and clearly the dollar has been put at jeopardy. Okay, FDIC insuring a whole bunch of assets puts the dollar at jeopardy. See, that's just logical. You can understand that. If there's a likelihood that more dollars are going to be printed, that puts it at jeopardy. If we were talking about gold, and we actually had a Fort Knox full of zillions of dollars of gold, and there was some thing that was going to make it inevitable that we would have to release a whole bunch of gold, you could understand how that would affect markets. So why is cash all of a sudden, you don't understand that there's a liability to release a bunch of cash, and that would degrade the firmness, the strength of the dollar to survive a crisis. Alright, anyway. Alright, so I'm supposed to bullet point this. But we've already been through some of these points, and so yeah, I wrote down some stuff, but yeah, I guess I'd have to go through all the videos and come up with all the explanations all over again. So I'm going to say that what we have is a barter system at its core, and we can make promises, IOUs, based on, the strength of a handshake or the strength of previous reliabilities. And but it's a barter system. We're trading one thing for another thing. At the core, that's what the system is at its core. We trade work for some sort of power to go out into the world and buy food and a house and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, we're exchanging value, and that to make those exchanges, you need some sort of pricing, and the pricing is decided by the market when you convert something. So when you trade goats for giraffes, you might figure out how many goats a giraffe is worth, and vice versa, but it doesn't tell you much about how much a barrel of oil is relative to a giraffe. So you have to do a trade with giraffes and oil to figure out those balances. And so sensibly, a system like that, a barter system, would tend to want to reduce to a standard, to having one thing that could be traded for anything because the pricing was already established. And I guess salt became that for a while. Lots of things became currency that were commodities, but they became the currency because they were transportable and they had an established value relative to everything else. So you could make a deal through that commodity. But all those commodities all broke down. For obviously salt isn't a very stable commodity. And I've sort of explained why gold isn't exactly Mr. Stable either. And so I've just argued that a great commodity is this synthetic one called cash. And it has these advantages where we can control how much of it exists. And if the entire system, the regulatory mechanism that negotiates the deals between things, uses that as the standard, like the Federal Reserve, and you pay taxes with this standard, then the standard becomes more and more established as a standard. It has more credibility as a standard. And so yeah, I've said it in the video, I think it has all the advantages and none of the disadvantages of something like gold as a standard. Now, you thinking that standards are irrelevant is okay, you can say that, but I don't think they really are. I think they are kind of necessary. I think you need a common denominator to make transactions efficient, and to make it possible to do this market pricing. You need something that's very universal. And I don't think a wheat future, or you go through all the list of all the other things that we could try to do this with to create a stability, a stable foundation. And I don't think anything else is as good as the stable foundation as this synthetically made for this exact purpose, to serve this exact purpose of being a transaction commodity. It's suited to the job because it's made for the job. Can I imagine a world without cash? Yes, kind of, maybe. But I think we'd still resort to something. There'd still be some place you'd want a flight to safety. You'd want to have something that was a flight to safety that didn't require you to buy a house or, go out and buy whatever. I don't know, plows, a whole bunch of plows or something. You would want something where it doesn't create this hoarding problem, which all the other commodities would do. So whenever there's a flight to safety, everybody be, hoarding stuff, creating inflation in that commodity, and that's no good either. Well, inflation in the price of the commodity. I don't know, and then you'd have this surplus problem when everybody tried to get out of their safety, and then all of a sudden their safety isn't safe anymore because now there's too many plows and too few buyers, and the price of plows crashes, and now you have a mess. And so you didn't even get anywhere safe because everybody bought plows. Let's see, how else to say this? So yeah, I'm just saying that in theory the currency is a great idea. In practice it's been ruined because now we have too many claims on the currency. Too many bad digit claims have been FDIC insured, and we have a bunch of crap in the reserve accounts that has a claim on cash. So we have trillions of dollars of claims on cash that can't possibly be liquidated short of printing. The system won't liquidate. The system won't be able to produce the cash without dragging an awful lot of stuff to market. And that's going to be very disruptive if I have to sell everything. Yeah, so there's no, especially for the unrich, there's no real flight to safety. They can't just go out and buy wheat futures or something. So they need good currency as a protection against bad digits. Okay. I think another side subject would be an understanding of what surplus is supposed to be versus what we've turned it into. I mean, I could certainly argue that somebody's surplus, like if they have an extra silo of wheat, that it'd be nice if the system guaranteed them a price for that wheat. That that silo would be worth the same thing it is now next year. And but this idea of profit off surplus kind of breaks the system, because then that's where you sort of have the beginnings of inflation being created, because now you have to create more money to be able to pay the interest or the profit. And clearly the way the government's borrowed money has nothing to do with borrowing money. It has nothing to do with mortgaging. It has nothing to do with leasing. Well, it may have something to do with leasing. Yeah, but they've rented everything. Everything we've bought on debt has been rented. It hasn't been bought because we never pay any of the debt off. And so it's a different equation. It's not as simple as saying, well, you borrow the money, then pay it back, and no harm, no foul, you pay a little interest, no big deal. No, it becomes a very big deal because you pay interest for decades, maybe even centuries. And yeah, that's no good. Rent is bad, okay? In the long term, it's not a long-term winner. It might be wise in the short term, but it's never wise in the long term. All right, something maintain its value, not gain value. Yeah, so surplus should be guaranteed to maintain value, not increase in value. But again, the whole idea of having perpetual ownership, which means that as soon as surplus goes into ownership because of inheritance and all this other crap, that ownership is never released. And so it's like in the art market, if you had an art market and people just were able to own it forever, you can sort of see how that's going to put very little on the market at a reasonable price. And that's sort of the problem here, is that ownership is perpetual, so nothing goes on the market for a reasonable price. There's nothing has to be paid for. It's just inherited. I mean, wealth is inherited. It's not earned, and that's a real problem. Okay, and then the interest in the cost of bankruptcy. So I always talk about the risk takers, but we know that the risk takers aren't the ones paying for the bankruptcies. The consumers pay for those. So that's another break in the system in terms of this accountability, right? Because they talk about taking risk, but they're not paying for the risk, especially shareholders. Shareholders giving a kind of immunity. They're only liable for losing the money they invested. They're not liable for the damage what they created, the company they fed and invested in. If that company did something horrendous like Enron and stole a whole bunch of money, how come the shareholders aren't liable to pay the money back? So they get away with a free bankruptcy. So it's another kind of bankruptcy where no one's paying the real cost of their risk-taking. Fukushima isn't being paid for by the shareholders of the electrical company. It's being paid for by the people of Japan. It should be the responsibility of the shareholders. They should go up to the shareholders and say, you owe $500,000 for your share of this mess that you helped create by investing in this company that had these bad practices. So I'm just saying, as long as you have a bankruptcy system that doesn't apply accountability to the people that caused the problem, and if you don't have a system that forces them to pay the real bill, not the, oh, I just lost that part of my fortune bill. It's like, it's like Trump. He decides to create all these little different businesses, so he can, and so if one of them goes bankrupt, they can't touch the other ones. So he can have huge liabilities. He can ruin people entirely, and he gets to walk away unharmed in any real way. Okay, so that's I'm just saying, but that whole subject of interest, the price of failure, I've said it before, there's no free lunch and there's no free failure. And the rich have engineered a system to give them both a free lunch and freedom from failure. Alright, so I know that's a side subject though. Price of the dollar established by number or amount in circulation. So this should be, I really shouldn't have to argue this. I don't think, how can you deny that the price of the dollar, the value of the dollar, is directly correlated to how many dollars are in circulation? And if you put more dollars in circulation, then the dollar will go down in value relative to other currencies. It's just a fact. And another thing that will drive a currency down is a lack of confidence in that currency. So if there's every prospect that in 5 years a country is going to start printing money because their liabilities have gotten so heavy and burdensome, then the value of their currency drops, and no one's going to invest in them based on that. And so they're just double ups on their problem, because just when they need to borrow money, they can't borrow money. But it's sort of for a good reason, because there's every prospect that they're going to inflate the money into no value, and you don't want to buy a bond in a currency that's going to pay you back in money that's only worth half as much as the money you invested. So that's kind of important, and I'm just saying that's kind of where America is now. If I was a reasonable currency trader, I could certainly see the writing on the wall that it's not going to take much of a crisis and America is going to start printing money, because it's not going to have an option. It's not going to be able to issue bonds because no one wants to buy them at the real rate, and only we're buying them off the market. We're the only fucking buyer lately. So it's like every bit of smell of a run on the printing press. And I wouldn't buy a 10-year bond. Would you buy a 10-year bond, a U.S. savings bond? Would you buy one? And you make this argument about what value the cash has. And I was thinking about it, and I'm saying, I bet you that your gold is in gold. I bet you haven't counted on having gold stock or a gold certificate or some sort of gold notes to a company that's supposed to have gold, I bet you have your own goddamn gold. So you're being a little hypocritical having this argument saying you can't tell the difference between a check and cash. I think you can tell the difference, and you'd rather have the cash, and you know it. Some sort of piece of paper, I owe you a piece of gold. You don't think it's the same thing as the gold. I mean, come on, you know it. Alright, so cash is the Federal Reserve standard. It converts all the digits into cash every day, and we pay our taxes in cash. We convert it through the Federal Reserve again, through the Treasury. And these are important distinctions of cash. It's an important role cash plays. You kind of break the idea of a flight to safety if you don't have strong cash. You force the entire civilization to adopt the irrationality of the risk takers if you don't have a strong standard somewhere, one that can't be destroyed by the rich. Like I said, I don't mind losing 2% value in my money if I had to lose 2% every year to not participate, to not pay the banks, I'm willing to lose 2% a year. That's how much contempt I have for their digits. But anyway, I don't know, do I need to say more? So maybe I'll think a little, it's when I have time for thinking. I'm still doing the physics thing too. So many things on my mind. Just the interest angle and the inflation thing. Inflation's an interesting subject. Because maybe we're just thinking about it wrong. Because it depends on where the inflation is, right? So I think this was sort of an important thing that I think we could probably disagree on, is understanding that I could argue, I think I can argue well, that the inflation in the stock market will have the consequence, when they do their flight to value thing, when they realize they're in a market that's bubbled, they'll do a flight to value. And when they do that flight to value, they're going to head for oil and coal and gas and food and all the other commodities and metals, and all of those inflations in those prices will be realized by consumers in the price of everything they buy. And that's when the inflation will become a consumer inflation. So it starts off with an inflation of a market, and that inflation in that market will be transferred into these other markets as the negative kind of inflation. But it is sort of an irony that the inflation in the stock market appears to be all win. I mean, who could complain? The rich are richer, which isn't necessarily terrible, right? I mean, at least somebody's richer. So I guess that's good, right? More money for America or something, right? So somehow America's richer because the stock market is up. Well, obviously it's not richer. If you look at the $4 trillion in reserve accounts, it's not richer because it owes the money back. But let's just pretend that it was real and that we're richer. Again, if that bubble is going to, when it starts to, the air starts going out, that air is going to blow up other things. And when that happens, then the inflation becomes bad inflation, not good inflation. But it did create inflation to put $4 trillion in reserve accounts and make digits out of it. It did create inflation. And it would have created more inflation more directly if you would have released the cash also. That would have made it just that much worse. Yeah, okay, it's probably enough. So chew on that and such, and see what kind of goop you can make out of it, and spit back the results. and such.